This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of March 18th, 2024. Alongside my tag team partner, Matt Mascardi, I'm Damian Rollis. On today's countdown, another out-of-control Golden Hello Award for an American CEO, the retirement of one of the most infamous fake independent directors, this one at McDonald's, voting recommendations from ISS and Glass Lewis at the Disney Proxy Cage match, a shareholder win at Analog Devices, and on the big vote, a spice company that pretends it's still the year 1602 in Amsterdam. Let's get to the top stories. Here's a weird one I haven't seen before. After Duke Energy announced that Harry Sedaris has been appointed as president, the company also decided to announce that current CEO and chair Lynn Good, who has been CEO since 2013, will, quote, continue on and after April 1st, 2024 as CEO and chair of the board.
That's confusing. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe she should be looking for other jobs.
Yeah, unless they're just saying like, look, Harry is just don't get it confused. Harry's just he's here for Lynn. That's who he's here for.
A leadership change at International Paper Company will see Andrew Silvernail become CEO in May, along with a Golden Hello package worth just over $21 million, including $200,000 in cash. Ready for this one, Matt? $200,000 in cash to support relocation expenses not covered under the company's current relocation policy.
What is he relocating?
And another $50,000 in cash for legal fees incurred receiving this massive Golden Hello package. But he's already asking for more money on the I guess the company's already antiquated relocation policy. So hats off to him.
Why not just give him the money and say spend it on whatever you... Why? I don't understand this constant trend of you give them extra money, but you identify all the things the extra money are for, like legal expenses incurred for the Golden Hello. Right? Like what?
Well, how about the practice alone in America of giving them $20 million before they've even done a thing? They haven't even done a single day of good work. They're going to get their customary, probably average $15 million in pay anyway. What are we awarding these people for? And finally, corporate governance legend is retiring at McDonald's, Matt. Board chair Enrique Rick Hernandez Jr., who has been on the board since the Clinton administration, is finally stepping down. Despite that many years, Matt, he's always referred to as independent. He's referred to currently as the independent board chair. Hernandez was infamously booted from the Wells Fargo board in 2018 as part of the scandal where Wells Fargo set overly aggressive sales targets that resulted in abusive practices towards consumers for over a decade. Remember, the government pushed for corporate governance changes because of that scandal, and Rick Hernandez was one of the people who left because of it. Hernandez also, who he inherited a securities services company from his dad, was engaged in multiple side dealings at Wells Fargo, resulting in nearly $25 million in deals over a decade. Still was an independent director somehow. He ironically sat on their corporate responsibility committee as well as chairing the finance and risk committees.
Yeah.
This means that a consolidation of power from McDonald's CEO Chris Kempczinski, who will absurdly become the chair as well as being the CEO. I don't think enough people point out how absurd that arrangement is, that in America they let the CEO be the chair of the body that provides oversight for the company's management. Absolutely absurd. And Matt, you'll like this one. Fellow Chicago business mafia director and former Abbott CEO Miles White will assume the role of lead independent director at McDonald's, despite having the second longest tenure. He's been there since 2009.
All right, I want to come back to the lead independent director joke later, but
I didn't say it was a joke.
But Rick Hernandez had 18% of the influence on the McDonald's board. That's a lot. He was a powerful dude on that board. And famously, Rick Hernandez, 75% connected to other McDonald's board members. And he's also sitting on Chevron's board where he's 92% connected, as in everyone on the Chevron board, Rick Hernandez has had dealings with on other boards some way. They're either friends of friends or directly friends. This guy is the penultimate, I've been everywhere, I don't know why he still has a job director.
He's the evil board director. He's at Chevron, McDonald's, Wells Fargo. He inherited his company from his dad. Shareholders routinely voted against him everywhere because he was, he's long tenure.
Let's dial that back because he still never got voted out. But
true.
He does have the dubious distinction in free flow analytics data of being one of just a handful of people in the entire world who bats 0 on controversies. He literally is the worst director in the world for the controversies that happen at companies where he's on the board.
I will say that in 2018, when he left the Wells Fargo board, he did 47% of shareholders voted to get rid of him. But it took the government to step in to have that happen.
It's nice that they couldn't even muster a majority.
Let's get back to our Disney proxy cage match. We seem to talk about that every week. This one at Walt Disney. Reuters is reporting today that ISS is backing Nelson Peltz in that proxy cage match because Nelson, quote, could be additive to the succession process, end quote.
Now that's analysis that you got to pay $200,000 a year to get.
ISS also said shareholders should abstain from voting for Jay Rasulo, all 3 Blackwell's candidates, and current Disney director Maria Elena Lagomasino. So they're agreeing with Nelson about one of his choices to target at Disney, but they're not. But they're supporting Nelson Peltz, but they're not supporting the man that Nelson Peltz thinks will also help the board, in Jay Rasulo. So kind of a mixed message there. Nelson Peltz also had some of his director friends send a letter to the Disney board. Yes, Matt, a letter that started off with "Dear Disney Directors," and this letter said that Nelson basically is a swell guy. This extremely diverse list of 13 directors included 3 directors from Heinz, 3 directors from Mondelez, 2 directors from Legg Mason, 2 from Janus Henderson, 2 from Wendy's, and even a woman. He found a woman to support him.
In. Wow.
Yep.
Can I just say, though, this completes the ISS duopoly of proxy fights this year at Starbucks and Disney now, in which at Starbucks they said the Starbucks board appears thoughtful, and the Disney putting Nelson Peltz on the board because it could be additive.
Could.
That's the analysis that we're doing. That's how we select directors now. It could be, appears, maybe. And they also had this to say. This is a quote. Disney put out comments on ISS's recommendation, and ISS actually noted that because 80% of Trian's Disney shares are borrowed from Ike Perlmutter, that they noted that this is Perlmutter's involvement is likely to be a, quote, unfortunate distraction, and that he could, quote, cast a baleful shadow over the board.
Yeah, let's not forget that Perlmutter is on record for many years of fighting with current CEO Bob Iger. So I don't understand ISS's recommendation on any
What
level
is this
here.
recommendation? We just empowered the guy who basically has personal animus against the CEO for fun, right?
Yeah, and with no track record in media, and with a poor track record overall at the companies where he served as director.
And he's borrowing the shares. And on the upside, though, we get to see ISS use words like baleful. It's like a Robert Frost poem.
On Monday, Glass Lewis recommended shareholders reelect all 12 of the company's directors. So they're saying no to all of the dissident candidates at Trian and Blackwell's. Here's a quote from that recommendation. Given what we believe is already a credible plan underway for Disney, we struggle to see many of Trian's intentions as representing a likely net gain for investors. That one's a bit more sober.
That one feels like a real recommendation, although I would have looked at Blackwell's. I don't know why no one is considering Blackwell's nominees. Like, why? They actually nominated an executive from a media company that doesn't hate Bob Iger.
I think you'll find that ISS and Glass Lewis rarely support dissident slates.
But still, like Blackwell's, if you look at the individuals that they nominated, at least one of them, Shell, right, has a media
Jessica
background.
Shell,
like that actually should count for something here. There's a viable candidate that isn't Nelson Peltz that could be additive to the board, and not a could be additive way, in an actual additive way.
Blackwell's continued its fight. In one filing, it said that Nelson Peltz billed Wendy's almost $600,000 for security-related services, and said that Disney deserves board members who are not scared of hamburgers sitting in the boardroom.
I do like that Nelson.
I support Blackwell's sense of humor throughout this whole process. They included in that an AI-generated picture of an old white man in a suit who looks like Nelson Peltz, shaking hands with a cheeseburger,
really angry cheeseburger,
with a big
really
cheeseburger,
angry.
Handing him cash. Yeah.
The
cheeseburger, and the cheeseburger's wearing gloves. It looks like. I don't know what's up the cheeseburger's hands.
Do they mean to say hamburglers? But that might be actually be copyright by.
I don't know. Let's move over. Move over to our vote results table. We have several votes in at large cap companies. Let's start with Starbucks. After the Strategic Organizing Center gave up its proxy fight, all directors and Say-on-Pay received more than 90% of the vote. However, when we adjust for the ESG skeptic vote, which means Vanguard, BlackRock, and Howard Schultz, Chair Melody Hobson, Nominating Committee Chair Jorgen Nudstrop, and Say-on-Pay managed the support of only 2/3 of the vote when you adjust that vote. Also, all three shareholder proposals failed miserably, especially the two anti-woke ones pretending to care about systemic discrimination and human rights. I think what you'll find this year, Matt, is that the anti-woke votes are having the unfortunate effect of dragging down the earnest shareholder proposals. They're actually looking for actual gains.
The plant-based milk pricing shareholder proposal shouldn't have won anyway, so it's hard to discern.
At Analog Devices, 28% of all voters rejected Say-on-Pay, a number that slips that down to 51% support when we adjust for ESG skeptics Vanguard and BlackRock. Also, a shareholder proposal brought by John Chevedden requesting a simple majority vote passed overwhelmingly with 89% support, despite the board recommending against that vote. So a win there at Analog Devices. At Agilent Technologies, more than 20% of shareholders want board chair Ko Boon Hui gone. He has been on the board for over 2 decades. And finally, there's plenty of discontent to report at Heiko Corporation. 38% voted no on nominating committee chair Mark Hildenbrandt, where the board has only 2 female directors representing a mere 3% of total board influence. And 26% were against Say-on-Pay, where the 3 Mendelsohn family board members and executives each received about $15 million in pay, while also receiving $250,000 in director fees, a practice not typically followed at American companies.
That's egregious.
We don't see that. We don't ever see that in America.
Double pay. That's your job.
Yeah, and that's a high vote against Say-on-Pay, considering 17% of voting power is held by the Mendelsohn family. So that's it for the vote table. That brings us to the big vote. This week we are covering Spices Company, McCormick and Company, whose annual vote is happening next week, March 27th, 2024. Let me highlight a few things that I'm sure Matt will cover. One is an unusual voting structure consisting of voting and non-voting shares I know, Matt, you're going to spend some time on this one, but it's a strange case where the voting shares all seem to be allocated mostly with the named executive officers and the board members. I've not really seen a structure like this before. As an example, 12% of these voting shares are held by Chair Lawrence Curtius. Again, it's just a situation that we don't often see. As far as the board is concerned, there's a considerable female power gap. They represent 33% of the board, but only 18% of influence. And the same goes for overall diversity when you include race and gender. They represent 50% of the board, but only 26% of influence. And finally, I'll say that when we're talking about influence, this is a board where 3 people control a majority of the influence. That's Executive Chair Larry Curtius, CEO Brendan Foley, and Lead Director Michael Mangan, controlling 55% of influence. So
this is a trifecta board. This is an oligarchy board, and I think it's worth saying that we debated in pre-production how we need to cover these kind of dual class, these weird structures where investors largely don't have a vote. There's a couple of institutional investors who own the voting shares, but most of it is actually either through the employee 401k, which is managed by Wells Fargo, but I think there are some shares that are held here and there, and that otherwise are held by management. And there's not much float to that. It's like it's the voting shares are very closely held, whereas the non-voting shares are what everyone has, which means you have no vote. And this is almost exactly, the spice trade has existed arguably since like 1500 BC.
1602.
That's AD. Because
a corporation.
The first IPO was a spice company. It was the Dutch East India Trading Company. And
1602 in Amsterdam, yeah.
The structure of that company was almost identical to this.
Hey, they say
bananas.
Say the Dutch are very good at business. So yeah, hats off to the Dutch.
And side note here, so they had participants, watchers, non-voting shares, and members who were voting shares, and you could speculate or you actually had influence. But this was the first IPO at VOC became the first activist investor at the same company and the birth of the corporate governance CSR movement. But really, the story of this company to me is not about the shares. No, your vote isn't really going to matter. And our debate has been, how do you talk about companies where your vote doesn't matter that much? How do we talk about that?
To be fair, from a retail investor's perspective, your vote probably doesn't matter at most companies. Not just including the Mark Zuckerberg controlled Meta platforms, but as we say over and over and over, that when you consider the power of the ESG skeptic vote at places like BlackRock and Vanguard, your vote really doesn't have much effect anywhere, Matt. Not just at McCormick and Company.
This is true, but if you wanted to get angry at the ESG skeptic vote for voting in every director, you can't here, right? Like they don't actually have shares that matter here. Here,
bizarrely, the directors themselves seem to have the say on who gets elected to the board.
Exactly, which is why Curtius has so much power, because he was the CEO. He accrued a bunch of shares by being the CEO, and now he owns 12% of the vote by himself. But the real thing...
let me add to that before you move on. Also, CEO Brendan Foley controls 3% of the vote. CFO Michael Smith has 3% of the vote. Yeah. And there are others. So it's not just Curtius. I mean, this is a really strange voting structure.
Yeah, it goes right down. It's like the executive team and the directors are controlling the directors of the company.
Yeah. It's also not clear how this system operates, because I opened up the last 8 proxy statements involving Curtius, and he seems to gain about 1 to 2% of voting power every year. Like there's some method in which they just keep doling out more and more power to him.
Yeah,
annually.
they only give the executives the voting share options, so you can't buy them on the market. They're like shelf registration. They're options, and they give them just to the executives, which is an interesting structure because it does incentivize the executives to stay longer and do well. The stock There are two traded stocks. You can see the voting shares and the non-voting shares. And there is a difference in price. In fact, it averages 0.09% more value on a daily trade basis for the last 5 years for the voting stock, as in the voting stock has a little bit more value. So there is some alignment, but it's weird.
Get out of the weeds. I want to hear your evaluation on the board here.
Well, here's where the board part becomes clear for me. Because you talked about how this is a trifecta board. It's the executive chair, the CEO, and the lead independent director. Now, the lead independent director has been there for more than a decade, right? The lead independent director is not very independent. Mangan, right? He's been there
since 2007.
So now it got me curious because the way I want to talk about this board is actually a much bigger problem, which is the joke that is lead independent directors. And you already mentioned one up top, where we're talking about directors who have been there for a decade and a half and are considered independent. It turns out in our data that there are 284 U.S. large cap companies out of 600 U.S. large cap companies where they have a CEO, chair combo, a founder on the board, or an executive chair, effectively a controlling executive, a very powerful controlling executive, and a lead independent director to offset that. Because corporate governance best practice is if you have a CEO, chair combo, put in a lead independent director, right? Mm-hmm. But that's 47% of U.S. large cap boards who have that structure. They have a lead independent director. So about half of large caps. But at those companies that have a lead independent director, 60% of the lead independent directors have been there for 10 or more years.
Right.
A majority of them are not independent by UK standards.
Yeah, often having served alongside the very same CEO.
In fact, that's the other thing I ran. Exactly 29% of them, about 30% of them, the same executive and the same lead independent director have overlapping tenures of 10 years or more.
I'll tell you, and this is one of my pet peeves with corporate governance in general, is that we talk about this all the time, is that a lot of progress was made 20 years ago with a lot of great corporate governance initiatives, including having a lead independent director on their board, including starting to pay attention to adding more women to the board. But nothing has happened since, right? Which is why I think our data is so important, because what companies have taken advantage of these practices, A, by putting women on the board and giving them no actual power. They have no influence. They're not in leadership roles. And B, by having lead independent directors in name only, which are really there more often than not to serve to consolidate the power of the CEO, which is the absolute worst case scenario and why American boards are so messed up in the first place. And
it gets worse because in McCormick's case, right, to make it about McCormick, the lead independent director, Mangan, he's been there for 17 years. His prior work was at a power tool company. There's actually literally no relevant skill overlap between their lead independent director and what happened. So what does that mean? That means just like at Disney, where you have no other media executives on the board, so Iger's the only one who knows what the company actually does, like how to run Disney, you have the same thing here, where the lead independent director, who's supposed to represent shareholders, to the extent there are any, actually has no idea how to run a spice company or a food company or a supply chain, difficulty or a company like there's no overlapping skill.
One could make the case, Matt, that people need tools as well as they need spices.
That's true. So maybe there is an overlap, but the data here is actually
a spice is a tool for the mouth, for the palate, for the diet, for the palate.
I didn't put that in our skills matrix. But there is, this is evidence, actually, when I dug into it, that the check the box, add a lead independent director if you have a CEO chair combo, does not work. It doesn't work at the majority of companies that do it because they've found a way to consolidate power even with the lead independent director. In fact, I created a hot list that shows the number of companies where both the executive in charge and the lead independent director are highly connected to the other directors on the board, and they have significant influence. So imagine a scenario where you join a board because you met like the director at at a gala somewhere. You get to the board and you find out the CEO, who's calling the meeting because they're the chair also, worked with the lead independent director on this board for more than 10 years. And they know all the other board members. What kind of board is that? Who does that represent?
Case in point, we just talked about at the top of the show, Chris Kempczinski becoming chair at McDonald's, CEO. And who does he appoint as the lead independent director? Miles White, one of the most well-known Chicago area CEOs, been on the board for over 15 years. Yeah.
So here's my recommendation. To the extent that you could vote because you have voting shares, right? If you are a McCormick employee at the 401k, you should write to your 401k administrator, which I believe is Wells Fargo, and you should tell them, this vote has to be vote against the lead independent director, Mike Mangan. You aren't independent. You don't represent the employee interests. You only represent management interests. That's the way that works. Like there's McCormick is a case study in a broader problem about lead independence that isn't real. But McCormick should be, if you could vote, that's who you would vote out. That's my only recommendation for the directors on this board.
Again, it goes back to something that I mentioned, a bit earlier, is that there's not enough has happened with this original set of corporate governance initiatives, right? I mean, I think it's time for investors to just take the next step with some of this. Like, stop rubber stamping everything that. If they have a lead director, good, it's fine. They have 3 women on the board. Like, just dig in a little bit deeper. We need to start paying more attention to these things.
I don't quite understand the desperate need for a binary where it's like CEO chair, must have lead independent director. And that's where the analysis stops.
I think it was a good start. I mean, again, I applaud the changes 20 years ago.
Or 30 or 30 years ago.
It's the same thing with they fought for years to get this incredible amount of compensation disclosure, right? Including an enhanced compensation table, enhanced disclosure of all of the parts of the short-term and long-term plan. And yet nothing has happened. Shareholders are not voting against it anymore. Pay keeps going up routinely year after year. I mean, we have to start doing something with these gains that we got 20 years ago.
And investors keep voting against. When they do vote against pay, they just vote against pay and maybe the head of the pay committee, but not the directors who set the pay.
I agree. It's almost bananas. Like we've all of us in the ESG industry, all of us in corporate governance have just been mailing it in since the pioneers 20 years ago. The Bob Monks and El Minos. Ever since they fought for these changes, nothing has really happened since. It's disappointing.
I will say on the upside in this company, just to wrap out the directors, I really actually liked one of them. I think the majority of these directors are actually fine. They're well suited.
Be positive. Who do you like?
But it's nice to be positive every once in a while. Michael Conway is exactly the kind of director who on paper you want to keep. In fact, I would suggest that if you're engaging at all, you ask why he's not chairing a committee. This is a guy who went through the Starbucks Corporation, through basically every piece of the Starbucks Corporation in the past, decade, and he knows the business of spices, supply chain issues, diversity, all of the issues that are relevant at a place like McCormick. He's the kind of guy that knows them, at least on paper, right? That's that we can see. So there are good things about these board members, but we need to get rid of this. It's not a real lead independent director. We need to actually start analyzing the people.
Yeah, and it points out one of the problems I mentioned this at the start of talking about McCormick was that Michael Conway, one of the diverse board members, a black man, has no leadership positions.
None.
You're pointing out his incredible credentials, and you're right. He is both domestically and internationally held many executive positions at Starbucks. Clearly, a guy who's well suited for everything. He sits on the nomination committee. That's it.
That's it. That's
right. No leadership positions. So okay. So your recommendation is a vote against the lead director, Michael Mangan, which What is sending a message to do what? To find a new lead director?
Well, look,
lead
in this situation, first of all, let's drop the pretense that person's independent and drop the pretense that they're leading anything, right? Like this is a company where the voting shares are owned by everybody else anyway. And second of all, you're voting out a very long tenured director who's supposed to represent shareholders and doesn't. And third of all, you're sending a message that lead independence should mean something. And from this point on, we're going to look at companies who have lead independent directors and ask, are they actually independent as individuals relative to the other board members, not some check the box 25 years ago methodology.
Do you want to weigh in here on Say on Pay, or do you want
to? Look, I think Say on Pay is irrelevant at this company. This is an underperforming company. The stock has not done well. The fact that everyone gets paid and a lot of options and continues to vote themselves into directorships is a problem. But I don't think you're going to solve it until you have voting shares. I would vote against Pay until the company doesn't. In the last 5 years, the company has returned 5% TSR, and meanwhile, the rest of the S&P is at like 109%. So this is a well underperforming company. I don't know who you're paying for what. So I'd vote against it.
2 takeaways on Say on Pay, and then we'll wrap up here. First of all, this is a company where the executive chair routinely makes the most money by a lot. So really, this is one of the instances where I think the executive chair really is in control. And our influencer data, the only place we can get it is here, reflects that. Curtius's influence is double that of the CEO Foley. So, and then I'll take my hat off to McCormick, because when Foley became CEO in September, they actually did not give him any special promotional equity grants. They didn't line his pockets with anything.
Well, that's a start.
That's the proxy countdown for the week of March 18th, 2024. Join us next week when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool. Forever on the lookout for shareholder sharks, floating band-aids, and wayward directors.